The Palmerston forts were built in 1860 to defend from the invasion from the land, which never did happen. Fortunately or unfortunately, whether or not the French government at the time got wind of what was happening and thought, well, we'll knock that idea on the head and we'll think of something else. But it didn't happen, and as they quite rightly now have been branded for many, many years as Palmerston's Follies. The British government at the time felt that the French government were going to plan an invasion in this country, and the whole idea was to destroy the British fleet of warships, wooden warships at the time, that were based in the Portsmouth dockyard. And the idea was that they were going to send a large contingent of men and ships and land on the south coast where it was flat, bring them round and then put their cannons on top of where we are standing at the moment on Portsdown Hill and fire their cannons and destroy the warships. They could then plan an invasion of this country a lot easier if they didn't have to contend with the British warships going out to meet them. The British government at the time thought, right, okay, well, we'll protect the Portsmouth dockyard by forming this ring of steel along the top of Portsdown Hill. A company based in London won the contract for Fort Purbeck and Fort Widley, and they were around about just over £100,000 at the time. So in 1860, the value of £100,000, what that is, recreate that back into hundreds of millions of pounds in today's value, they would never ever be built. Everything was built, manufactured, made locally. It's estimated there's about 10 million bricks in each of the forts, and they took around about 8 years to build. And everything was by hand. The whole thing was hewn out of chalk, out of the Portsdown Hill, and everything was done by pitchfork and shovel, wheelbarrows. You know, it's just an amazing feat. You know, these buildings are 160 years old. No laser measurements. You know, it was done by string and plumb line. And you just can't imagine the scale of these and how many thousands of people there must have been working on site in one of these for 8 years. How, you know, not just one, but, you know, 18 of these were built. It's just incredible. And they're still as a living memory today, and I'm sure that looking at the structure of these places, that they'll still be standing for hundreds and hundreds of years to come.
The history of the Portsmouth fortifications is a really interesting case study of politics and fear and concern about what other countries are up to. They're really intended to defend the country against France, but they're finally completed at a time when France is no longer anything like a threat on the international scene. The thinking about these forts goes back to the 1850s. On the throne in France is a figure called the Emperor Napoleon III, who's actually the nephew of the original great Napoleon of half a century earlier. And a lot of British thinking at the time is dictated by the memory of those earlier Napoleonic wars, that between the very end of the 18th century and 1815, France under Napoleon really had ripped up the map of Europe, had challenged Britain for global domination, had forced them into a war which had lasted on and off over 20 years. And the memory of that war and that experience was really still dominant in the British political class right through into the 1850s. You still have the Duke of Wellington, who'd won the Battle of Waterloo, was still an active politician right up to his very old age in the 1850s. So thinking about France in terms of Napoleon, in terms of France being really the hereditary enemy of Britain, was very much part of British political life. And there are kinds of ironies around this, around the period that we're thinking of in terms of the forts. Because in fact, Britain and France had fought on the same side in the Crimean War in the early 1850s against Russia, which is the occasion for famous events like the Siege of Balaclava and the charge of the Light Brigade. But even then it was noted that some of the British generals sometimes found it hard to remember that they were actually fighting with the French and not against them. This generational memory of being afraid of France, concerned with French power, is very much part of the landscape. And in the period we're talking about, up to the 1860s, France is the only European power with a major navy and a major army that could really pose a threat to British power. And a decision is taken that Portsmouth, as the home of the Royal Navy, the most important naval dockyards, most important naval base, needs to be defended to protect really against the idea that the French would invade the country and specifically invade and destroy Portsmouth as a way of damaging the power of the Royal Navy.
Part of the fortifications was that the ditch was there so that it was another barrier for someone who's going to attack the fort to actually get into. So they'd have to climb down a 50-foot wall, go across a 20, 30-foot ditch, then up again into the fort itself. The main reason for the tunnels was as an escape route. So if people did get into the moat and get into the building, then all the soldiers that were here defending the fort could then go back up the tunnel and close the gates at the top. Because you can imagine it's all in pitch black. There was no lights and all they had was either candles or lanterns, oil lanterns. The idea was that if one fort was captured, then they wouldn't know what was the layout of the other forts. So they were completely different. Some have got various different configurations at the end of the tunnels. They've all got spiral staircase in the middle of them, because that was the only way when they had the heavy lorries bringing in equipment and things and shells, that they drove it into the fort up onto the parade ground, and then by winch they would winch it down through the spiral staircase and then bring it out into the guns that were here throughout the ends of the forts and in the main building itself. At the end of all the tunnels, we've got these rooms set out where upstairs and downstairs you can see the rifle slits in each of the forts, where the soldiers defending could put their rifles through and fire on any of the people that were trying to get into the fort. But in the main rooms, looking straight the way down the ditch, they had these big cannons, and the recoil rings are still in the walls and the ceiling that took the recoil from the cannons when they were fired. All the gunpowder and shells and cannonballs that were used had to be housed in what they call the magazines, which were again two big rooms that were hewn out of the chalk and brick lined, double brick lined, because obviously in the event of an explosion they would need that as a buffer, because obviously you couldn't take a naked flame in there, you couldn't take anything in there. Otherwise it would just blow up. So what they did was they had these little cutouts where they used to put the lanterns in so that they could actually see what they were doing. The magazines are set right by the actual main tunnel coming down. And the idea was that if there was an explosion, then that would bring down the whole of the tunnel complex in that area. Then how would people, the soldiers that were defending, how would they actually get out? They would put another tunnel round a D-shaped tunnel around so that if there was an explosion, then you could still get out. So again, you know, it was well thought out, completely well thought out, and every single fort has got something different about it, and that was the way it was planned.
The whole situation, which has created the perceived need for these Portsmouth forts, comes to an end in 1870 and 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. That Prussia, bringing together all the forces of a Germany which is shortly to be unified, defeats the French armies in the field, lays siege to the fortified city of Paris, and forces it to capitulate in the winter of 1870-71. And after that defeat and humiliation, on the one hand, France is no longer really in a position to be seen as this predominant enemy which is going to threaten the position of ports of the Royal Navy. And on the other hand, the threat from Germany is of a different kind. And as we move into a different generation of warfare, for example, by the end of the century, talking about building dreadnought warships with extremely long-range artillery, the idea that you can defend a position like Portsmouth with an array of fixed forts is really something that passes into history. So the Portsmouth fortifications made sense at the time they were built, but everything about them very rapidly became obsolete. The geopolitical situation, the technological situation really left them standing as monuments to a period in the mid-19th century where everything about the context was very different from how it would be 30 or 40 years later.
Who knows, that they may have been a good insurance policy at the time, that this country was never invaded in that way. So you could say, well, it did work. And other people say, well, it was a complete waste of time and money because it never happened. Well, you know, it's a good argument.